The rain fell in a relentless rhythm, its patter muffling the distant hum of the city that never truly slept. Neon lights, flickering with half-hearted vigor, cast their colors on the slick pavement, painting streaks of crimson and electric blue across the alleyways. Ethan Carter pulled his hood tighter, the fraying edges barely keeping the cold droplets from soaking his skin. He knew better than to take the shortcut through 5th Street at night, but tonight, caution had been overruled by exhaustion. The smell of damp concrete and decay clung to the air, heavy and oppressive, matching the weight in Ethan's chest. His worn sneakers splashed through shallow puddles, the sound echoing against the crumbling brick walls. He avoided eye contact with the few shadowy figures that lingered at the edges of the street, their gazes heavy with unspoken judgment. Ethan had always been invisible, blending seamlessly into the background of the city's chaos. A ghost among the living, he moved through life unnoticed, unremarkable, and, as he often reminded himself, unworthy of more. Yet tonight, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching him. It began as a prickle at the nape of his neck, a subtle but undeniable awareness that he wasn't alone. He glanced over his shoulder, but the street stretched empty behind him, save for the faint shimmer of rain catching the distant glow of a street lamp. The silence felt wrong, too complete, as if the city itself was holding its breath. He quickened his pace, his pulse matching the rhythm of his steps. Ahead, the alley narrowed into an almost suffocating corridor of shadows, a shortcut he'd taken a dozen times before. Tonight, however, it felt more like a trap. "Well, well," a voice drawled, breaking the silence. Ethan froze mid-step. From the shadows emerged a figure he knew all too well, Bruno. Towering and broad-shouldered, Bruno carried the confidence of someone who had never met an obstacle he couldn't punch through. His crew materialized behind him, their faces a gallery of smirks and sneers. "Didn't think you'd be stupid enough to wander through here at night, Carter," Bruno said, his grin as sharp as the knife he flipped casually between his fingers. Ethan's throat tightened. "I'm just passing through," he said, his voice low, though it trembled at the edges. Bruno took a step closer, the knife catching the neon light in a flash of menace. "That's the problem, see? This is our street, and you didn't ask permission." Ethan's instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet remained rooted to the ground. He knew the futility of trying to escape. They'd catch him before he made it a block. The gang closed in, their laughter low and predatory. Bruno gestured with the knife, the motion casual but deliberate. "You've been a thorn in my side for a long time, Carter, always skulking around acting like you're better than us." "I don't," Ethan began, but the words died in his throat as Bruno raised the blade. "Shut up," Bruno snapped, his grin vanishing. "I'm tired of seeing your face." Ethan braced himself, his hands clenched into fists, though he knew they wouldn't save him. The gang tightened their circle, cutting off every escape route. Time seemed to stretch, the moment before violence heavy with inevitability. And then, it happened. A flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a blur too fast to track. Before Ethan could process it, a figure stepped into the circle of light cast by a dim street lamp. She was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Her skin was a striking shade of blue, shimmering faintly as if it absorbed the light around her. Her tall, lean frame exuded an elegance that contrasted sharply with the urban grime. Her features were sharp and angular, her eyes luminous pools of silver that seemed to pierce straight through him. She moved with a predator's grace, each step deliberate and unhurried. "Leave him," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of authority that silenced the gang instantly. Bruno blinked, momentarily stunned, before his expression twisted into a sneer. "What the hell is this? Some kind of freak show?" The woman didn't respond. Her gaze swept over the gang, assessing, calculating. Bruno raised the knife, aiming it in her direction. "You don't belong here, lady. Get lost before you get hurt." The corner of her mouth twitched. Was it a smirk? Before anyone could react, she moved. The gang never stood a chance. In a blur of motion, she disarmed Bruno with a fluidity that seemed almost rehearsed. The knife clattered to the ground as her hand shot out, striking his wrist with precision. Spinning, she used his weight against him, sending him sprawling into a puddle. The others lunged at her, but she was faster. A sweep of her leg sent one crashing to the ground. An open palm strike knocked another unconscious. The fight was over in seconds, leaving the gang groaning and disoriented on the wet pavement. Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The woman turned to him, her silver eyes locking onto his. "You're safe now," she said, her voice softer this time. Who are you?" Ethan stammered. She hesitated, the question hanging in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though she might answer, but then she glanced at the gang, who were beginning to stir. "No time for questions," she said, her tone brisk. "You need to leave. But now." The urgency in her voice propelled him into motion. As he stumbled away, he cast one last glance over his shoulder, just in time to see her vanish into the shadows, leaving only the faint shimmer of rain and the groans of defeated bullies in her wake. Ethan didn't stop running until he was safely inside his small apartment, the door locked and bolted behind him. His heart pounded in his chest, but his thoughts raced even faster. Who was she? What was she? And why had she saved him? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. His life had changed forever in that single impossible moment. Ethan couldn't sleep. Hours had passed since the encounter on 5th Street, but his mind replayed the events with relentless clarity. The rain had stopped, leaving his tiny apartment shrouded in a damp stillness. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old radiator struggling against the winter chill. Ethan sat at the edge of his sagging couch, staring at the window, where faint traces of neon still danced on the glass. Every logical explanation his mind conjured crumbled beneath the memory of her. Her blue skin, her impossible grace, her eyes, those luminous silver eyes that had pierced through him like they could see every secret he'd ever kept. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake the lingering sensation of her presence. "Who are you?" he whispered into the emptiness, his voice barely audible over the hiss of the radiator. The question hung in the air, unanswered, until a sound cut through the silence like a knife, a knock at the door. Ethan froze. It was late, far too late for visitors, and the part of the city he lived in wasn't known for friendly neighbors. The knock came again, firmer this time, each impact resonating in his chest. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. Moving cautiously, he approached the door and peered through the peephole. What he saw made him stagger back, his breath catching in his throat. It was her. She stood in the dim hallway, her blue skin muted by the flickering light of a faulty overhead bulb. Her silver eyes seemed to glow faintly, even through the warped glass. For a moment, Ethan considered pretending he wasn't home, but then her voice broke the silence. "Ethan Carter," she said, her tone calm but insistent. "Open the door." How does she know my name? His hand hovered over the lock, his mind a storm of hesitation. He could still feel the weight of her presence from earlier that night, a mix of awe and unease he couldn't fully define. Finally, curiosity overpowered caution, and he turned the lock with a soft click. As the door creaked open, she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her movements as fluid and controlled as they had been in the alley. Up close, her appearance was even more striking. Her skin shimmered faintly, like the surface of a polished stone, and her features were sharper than he remembered, almost otherworldly in their precision. She wore a dark, form-fitting jacket that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room, its texture unfamiliar and distinctly unearthly. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying a quiet urgency. Ethan closed the door slowly, his back pressing against it, as if it were the only thing keeping him from being swept away by her intensity. You saved me," he stammered. "Why?" Kaylara, though he didn't know her name yet, tilted her head slightly, studying him as if deciding how much to say. "Because you were in danger. she replied simply. That's not an answer, Ethan said, his voice firmer now. The adrenaline from the night had dulled, replaced by a growing frustration at being left in the dark. Who are you? What are you? Her gaze softened, though the tension in her posture remained. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. My name is Kalara, she said. I'm not from this planet. Ethan's stomach tightened. The words, so matter-of-factly delivered, hung in the air like a challenge. He wanted to laugh, to dismiss her as a lunatic, but the memory of her in the alley, the way she moved, the way she fought, stilled his skepticism. Not from this planet, he repeated, the words feeling strange on his tongue. You're an alien? If that's the term you use, then yes, she said. Ethan sank into the nearest chair, the weight of her confession pressing down on him. Why me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did you save me? Kalara hesitated, her silver eyes flickering with something Ethan couldn't quite read. Because I had to, she said finally. You're important. Important? Ethan frowned. I'm nobody. Just some guy who works a dead-end job and gets picked on by lowlifes. Why would I be important to you? Kalara took a step closer, her presence filling the room. You wouldn't understand yet, she said, but you have something, a connection, a legacy that ties you to my people. Ethan stared at her, his thoughts racing. Her people? Legacy? The words felt like pieces of a puzzle he didn't have the edges for. This is insane, he muttered. Perhaps, she said, her tone tinged with something like regret. But it's the truth. Before he could respond, a sharp noise shattered the tense quiet, a crash from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. Kalara moved instantly, her posture shifting into something predatory. She crossed the room in 2 strides, her hand pressing against the wall beside the window. Ethan barely had time to react before she turned to him, her expression grim. They found me, she said. Who? Ethan asked, his heart pounding. Kalara didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her jacket, producing a sleek metallic device that glimmered faintly with an internal light. She pressed a button, and the air in the room seemed to hum with energy. What is that? Ethan asked, his voice rising with panic. A shield, she said. It'll buy us time. Time for what? Kalara turned to him, her expression unyielding. To run. The urgency in her voice left no room for argument. Ethan grabbed his coat, his hands trembling as he followed her toward the door. Outside, the hallway was dark, the flickering bulb now completely extinguished. As they stepped into the shadows, Ethan felt the weight of her presence beside him, a strange mixture of fear and safety. He didn't know what he'd just stepped into, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back. And in the depths of his mind, one question burned brighter than all the rest. Who was chasing her, and why did it feel like they were chasing him, too? Ethan's lungs burned as he followed Kalara down the narrow alley. The city loomed around them, a maze of decaying brick and rusted metal, punctuated by the intermittent glare of neon signs. The oppressive silence was broken only by the distant hum of the shield Kalara had activated, its faint energy signature lingering in the air like static electricity. She moved with a predator's grace, her every step deliberate yet fluid. Ethan, on the other hand, stumbled behind her, his breath ragged from equal parts exertion and fear. Where are we going? He hissed, casting a wary glance over his shoulder. Kalara didn't answer immediately. Her silver eyes scanned the shadows ahead, her hand gripping the strange metallic device as if it were her lifeline. Somewhere they can't track us, she said finally, her voice a taut wire of tension. Ethan wanted to press further, to demand answers, but the look on her face silenced him. He had seen fear before, his own reflected back at him countless times in the cracked mirror of his apartment. But this was different. Kalara wasn't just afraid. She was calculating, planning, every fiber of her being attuned to an invisible threat he couldn't see. They reached an intersection where the alley split in two. Kylara hesitated, her head tilting slightly, as if listening for something Ethan couldn't hear. Then, without warning, she grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the left path. "Faster," she urged. Ethan stumbled but kept pace, his mind racing with questions. What had he gotten himself into? Who, or what, was chasing them? And why did it feel like every step he took with Kylara was pulling him further away from the world he thought he knew? The answer came sooner than he expected. They emerged from the alley into an abandoned industrial yard, the skeletal remains of machinery silhouetted against the orange glow of distant streetlights. Kylara slowed, her gaze sweeping the area with the precision of a sniper. "Here," she said, pointing to a derelict warehouse with shattered windows and a rusted metal door hanging off its hinges. "We'll be safe for now." Ethan followed her inside, his every nerve screaming in protest. The air was thick with the scent of oil and decay, the faint echo of their footsteps magnified by the cavernous space. Kylara led him to the far corner of the building, where she crouched low behind a stack of rusted barrels. "What's going on?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound steady. Kylara didn't look at him. Instead, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small spherical device. She pressed a button, and the sphere began to emit a soft, pulsing light, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "It's a distortion field," she explained, her tone clipped. "It'll mask our presence temporarily." Ethan stared at the sphere, its alien technology both mesmerizing and unsettling. Mask us from what? Kylara met his gaze for the first time since they'd fled. "Not what?" she said. "Who?" Before he could respond, a faint sound reached his ears, a low, mechanical whine, growing louder with each passing second. Kylara's expression hardened. "They're here," she said. Ethan's heart plummeted. "Who's they?" Kylara didn't answer. Instead, she rose to her feet, her movements sharp and controlled. She handed him the distortion sphere, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. "Stay hidden," she said. "What? No," Ethan protested, panic bubbling to the surface. "You can't just leave me here." Kylara's gaze softened, though her resolve remained unyielding. "I'll draw them away," she said. "You'll be safer if they don't know you're with me." "Safer?" Ethan scoffed, his voice rising. "I don't even know what's going on. How am I supposed to survive?" A deafening crash cut him off, the sound reverberating through the warehouse like a thunderclap. The metal door they had entered through was torn from its hinges, hurled across the room with a force that defied logic. Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice as a figure stepped through the jagged opening. It was humanoid in shape, but far from human. Its body was encased in sleek black armor that seemed to absorb the light around it, and its eyes glowed an unnatural red. The air grew heavy with an otherworldly hum, the creature's presence radiating an aura of menace that made Ethan's skin crawl. Kylara stepped forward, placing herself between Ethan and the intruder. Her posture was rigid, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and dangerous. The armored figure tilted its head, the motion eerily mechanical. "You cannot escape, Kylara," it said, its voice a distorted growl. "Surrender the human and we may yet show mercy." Ethan's stomach twisted. "They're after me?" Kylara's lips curled into a defiant smirk. "You don't know me very well, do you?" The creature lunged, its movements unnaturally fast. Kylara met it head-on, her body a blur of motion as she dodged and countered, with a precision that left Ethan breathless. The clash of their struggle echoed through the warehouse, the impact of each blow sending vibrations through the floor. Ethan pressed himself against the barrels, clutching the distortion sphere like a lifeline. He wanted to run, to escape the chaos unfolding before him, but something kept him rooted in place. Was it fear? Or was it the growing realization that Kylara was risking her life to protect him? The battle reached a fever pitch, the alien intruder growing more relentless with each attack. Kaylara fought back with equal ferocity, her movements a deadly dance of survival. But then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the creature landed a devastating blow, sending her crashing into a nearby wall. Ethan's heart stopped. "Kaylara!" he shouted, the sound torn from his throat before he could think better of it. The creature turned toward him, its red eyes locking onto his. Ethan's grip tightened on the distortion sphere, his mind racing. He had no idea how it worked, no clue what he could do to defend himself. But as the creature advanced, one thought overpowered his fear. He couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Ethan pressed the sphere against the floor and activated it. The warehouse erupted in a blinding pulse of light, the distortion field surging outward with a force that sent the creature staggering. Kaylara, battered but not broken, seized the opportunity, launching herself at their assailant with renewed determination. As the two clashed once more, Ethan felt a surge of something he hadn't known in years: hope. And as the battle raged on, one question burned in his mind. What was it about him that made him worth fighting for? The world around Ethan hummed with an unnatural energy, the distorted aftershock of the field Kaylara had activated earlier. The air was heavy with tension, and the faint smell of ozone lingered in the warehouse, mingling with the metallic tang of rust and fear. Kaylara leaned heavily against a pillar, her breathing labored and her movements slower than before. The sleek black figure of the alien intruder lay motionless in a heap across the room, its armor sparking faintly. For now, the threat was neutralized, but the victory felt fleeting, fragile. Ethan moved cautiously toward her, the distortion sphere still clutched in his trembling hands. "Kaylara," he said softly, unsure if his voice would startle her. "Are you okay?" She looked up, her silver eyes dimmed with exhaustion but still sharp. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed the strain she was under. "But we don't have much time. That was only one of them." "One of them?" Ethan echoed, his stomach twisting. Kaylara nodded, pushing herself upright with a grim determination. "They're hunters," she explained, her voice tinged with urgency. "They won't stop until they have what they came for." "And what is that exactly?" Ethan demanded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What do they want from me?" Kaylara hesitated, the faintest flicker of conflict crossing her expression. She glanced toward the downed hunter, then back at Ethan, as if weighing the consequences of her next words. "You," she said finally. "They want you, Ethan." The weight of her answer hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his mind racing. "Me? Why? I'm nobody. I don't—" "You're not nobody," Kaylara interrupted, her tone fierce. She stepped closer, her presence both grounding and intimidating. "You carry something within you, a genetic marker from my people, a link that binds you to us in ways you can't yet understand." Ethan stared at her, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and confusion. "A genetic marker? What does that even mean? Are you saying I'm part alien?" Kaylara shook her head. "Not exactly. Your ancestors were seeded with traces of our DNA millennia ago. My people sought to ensure humanity's survival, to give you a chance to thrive. But the marker you carry is rare. It's a direct connection to my line, to my people's past. That's why the hunters are after you. They want to exploit that connection, to use you as leverage against us." The room seemed to spin around him. The weight of her words was almost too much to bear. He wanted to laugh, to call it absurd, but the raw sincerity in her voice left no room for doubt. Ethan sank to the floor, his back against the cold metal barrel. "So what? I'm some kind of alien relic? A pawn in some intergalactic chess game?" Kaylara crouched in front of him, her expression softening. "You're more than that," she said quietly. "You're important, to them, to me. That's why I had to save you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ethan looked at her, his heart pounding. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "Because I wasn't sure how you'd react," she admitted. and because knowing the truth puts you in even greater danger. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. Danger seems to follow me whether I know the truth or not. Kaylara didn't argue. Instead, she reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was surprisingly gentle, grounding him in the midst of his turmoil. "We don't have much time to dwell on this," she said. "The hunters will send reinforcements, and we need to be gone before they arrive." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay, what do we do?" Kaylara stood, her movements purposeful, despite the fatigue that weighed on her. "There's a safe house not far from here. It's equipped with the tools we need to prepare for what's coming." "What is coming?" Ethan asked, rising to his feet. Kaylara's gaze hardened, a storm brewing in her silver eyes. "War," she said, "unless we stop them." The journey to the safe house was a blur of dark alleys and deserted streets, the city's oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional distant sound of sirens. Ethan stayed close to Kaylara, his fear tempered by the strange sense of purpose her revelation had ignited. The safe house was hidden beneath an abandoned train station, accessible only through a rusted hatch concealed beneath a pile of debris. Kaylara led the way down a narrow metal staircase, the walls of the passage lined with faintly glowing symbols Ethan couldn't decipher. Inside, the space was sparse but functional. A row of monitors lined one wall, their screens flickering with alien text. Shelves were stocked with strange devices and tools, their purposes a mystery to Ethan. Kaylara moved with practiced efficiency, activating a console and scanning the room for supplies. Ethan hovered near the doorway, unsure of what to do. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "An outpost," Kaylara replied. "One of the few my people established on Earth. It's not much, but it'll give us an advantage." Ethan wandered over to one of the shelves, his eyes drawn to a small crystalline object that pulsed with a soft blue light. "What's this?" he asked, picking it up. Kaylara turned sharply, her expression unreadable. "Careful," she warned. "That's a resonance shard. It amplifies energy fields." Ethan quickly set the shard back down, his curiosity tempered by her warning. "What do we need to do to stop them?" he asked, shifting the conversation back to their immediate problem. Kaylara hesitated, her gaze flickering to the monitors. "There's a way to sever the hunter's link to Earth," she said, "but it's risky, and it requires your help." "My help?" Ethan echoed, his stomach sinking. Kaylara nodded, her expression somber. "The genetic marker you carry, it's the key. With it we can disable their tracking systems, disrupt their communications, but it'll put you in direct danger." Ethan's heart raced, the weight of her words sinking in. "If I don't help?" "They'll keep coming," Kaylara said simply, "and they won't stop until they have you, or until there's nothing left of this world to take." Ethan closed his eyes, the enormity of the decision pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life avoiding confrontation, running from danger. But now, with the stakes so high, he couldn't ignore the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Kaylara's gaze softened, a faint smile touching her lips. "You're braver than you think, Ethan." As she began preparing the equipment they would need, Ethan felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The mysteries that had once consumed him were beginning to unravel, revealing a truth he never could have imagined. But with every answer came new questions, and the road ahead promised even greater challenges. For the first time, Ethan felt ready to face them. In the quiet of the safe house, Ethan and Kaylara exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. They were two unlikely allies, bound by circumstances neither of them fully understood. And as the shadows of the past began to give way to the light of understanding, one thing became clear. The battle for survival was only just beginning. The pulse of the resonance shard in Ethan's hands mirrored the rhythm of his heart, a frantic, unrelenting beat. The crystalline object, now tethered to Kaylara's makeshift device, cast soft blue light across the cavernous interior of the safe house. Each pulse seemed to draw the walls closer, the air thicker with the weight of the impending moment. Kaylara worked with deft precision, her silver eyes narrowed in focus. The console before her hummed, a complex network of alien symbols dancing across the screens. Ethan could see the tension in her every movement, the slight tremor in her hands betraying the calm she struggled to project. "Once this activates," she said, her voice low and steady, "it'll send out a disruptive signal. The hunter's link to this world will be severed." Ethan nodded, gripping the shard tighter. "And it'll work because of me?" Kaylara's gaze softened as she turned to him. "Because of what's in you," she corrected. "Your connection to my people? It's a bridge. The shard amplifies that connection, turning it into something they can't counter." "And what happens to me?" Ethan asked, though he already suspected the answer. Kaylara hesitated, the brief silence filling the space between them. "It'll hurt," she admitted. "The shard's energy isn't meant for human bodies, but if you can hold on long enough, the feedback will overload their systems." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. The thought of pain didn't scare him as much as the idea of failing, of letting Kaylara and the planet down. "And if I can't?" Kaylara's expression hardened. "Then we lose, and they take you. Everything I've fought for, everything we've done, it'll mean nothing." The words hung in the air, stark and uncompromising. Ethan nodded again, steeling himself. "Let's do it," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. Kaylara reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "You're stronger than you know," she said softly. "Just hold on, Ethan. I'll be with you." The machine whirred to life, its hum rising to a piercing crescendo. Ethan stood at the center of the safe house, the shard glowing brighter with each passing second. Tendrils of energy crackled around him, arcing across his body in jagged flashes of light. The pain came suddenly, sharp and overwhelming. It felt as though his very bones were being pulled apart, every nerve ending aflame. Ethan gritted his teeth, a strangled cry escaping his lips. "Focus!" Kaylara's voice cut through the haze of agony, grounding him. "Keep the connection steady." He clung to her words, to the faint anchor of her presence. Through the blur of pain, he could see her moving around the console, her hands flying across the controls. Her determination was palpable, a force as tangible as the energy coursing through him. The room shook as the disruptive signal reached its peak. The screens on the console flickered, displaying erratic patterns. Outside, the distant sound of the hunter's ships grew louder, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to vibrate in Ethan's chest. "They're coming!" Kaylara shouted, her voice tinged with urgency. "Hold on just a little longer!" Ethan clenched his fists, his vision swimming. The shard in his hands pulsed violently, each beat sending a fresh wave of pain through his body. He could feel the hunter's presence, an oppressive force pressing down on him. But then, something shifted. The energy around him changed, no longer chaotic, but focused. It felt as though the shard was responding to him, aligning with his thoughts, his will. The pain ebbed, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. I can control it," Ethan gasped, his voice barely audible. Kaylara's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and hope. "Then do it," she urged. "Finish it." Summoning every ounce of strength, Ethan focused on the shard, pouring his resolve into it. The light grew blinding, filling the room with a brilliant blue glow. The hunter's ships outside let out a deafening screech, their engines faltering, and then silence. The shard's glow dimmed, the energy dissipating into the air. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The pain was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. Kaylara was at his side in an instant, her hands steady as she helped him to his feet. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with quiet awe. "The signal worked. They're gone." Ethan looked at her, his vision still hazy. They won't come back? Kalara shook her head. Not for a long time. The feedback from the shard will make this world invisible to them. The weight of her words sank in, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. The safe house was eerily quiet in the aftermath, the faint hum of the console the only sound. Ethan sat on the floor, his back against the wall. Kalara sat beside him, her expression unreadable. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Kalara glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Now, you live," she said simply. "You've earned that much." "And you?" Her smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "I'll keep fighting. There are other worlds out there, other threats. But for now, I'll stay. At least until I know you're safe." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. He had never asked for this, never imagined his life could change so drastically. But now, with Kalara by his side, he felt a strange sense of purpose. As they sat in silence, the shard pulsing faintly on the console, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. For the first time, he wasn't afraid. For the first time, he was ready. In the quiet of the safe house, under the soft glow of the shard, Ethan and Kalara shared a moment of peace. It was fleeting, fragile, but it was enough. Because even in the face of uncertainty, they had found something worth fighting for. Damian Cole hated the sound of his own footsteps. The echo of his shoes on damp pavement seemed unnaturally loud, amplified by the emptiness of the city street. The rain had stopped hours ago, but its evidence lingered in every puddle, and the clinging humidity that gave the night air a metallic edge. He adjusted his grip on his messenger bag, its weight pulling at his shoulder, and quickened his pace. The neon lights of the high-rise district reflected in fragmented ripples on the slick ground, casting jagged, multicolored patterns that shifted as he walked. The world around him hummed with the quiet life of a city that never truly slept. Muted conversations from far-off alleys, the distant rumble of an engine, the occasional crackle of static from a malfunctioning display screen. It wasn't any of these sounds that unnerved him. It was the silence that followed. For the past week, Damian had felt it, that peculiar absence of sound that seemed to settle over him like a second skin whenever he left work. At first, he'd dismissed it as paranoia, the product of late nights and too much caffeine. But now, with each passing day, the sensation had grown more oppressive, more real. He felt watched, as though unseen eyes tracked his every move. He'd considered mentioning it to someone, a friend, a coworker, but the thought always died in his throat. What would he even say? "Hey, I think I'm being stalked by..." nothing? His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag as he approached the alley shortcut to his apartment. It wasn't the smartest route, but it shaved a good 5 minutes off his commute, and tonight he wanted nothing more than to be home. The alley yawned before him, a narrow corridor framed by crumbling brick walls and overhanging fire escapes. A single flickering streetlight cast erratic shadows that danced along the pavement, their movement too sharp, too unnatural. Damian hesitated. "This is ridiculous," he told himself. "You're a grown man afraid of shadows. Just keep walking." He stepped into the alley, the faint click of his heels swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Halfway through, the silence deepened. His ears popped, as though the air itself had thickened around him. Damian slowed, his pulse quickening. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a glint, a brief golden shimmer at the edge of his vision. He turned, squinting into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the familiar outlines of garbage bins and cracked walls. He exhaled, forcing a shaky laugh. "Get a grip, Cole," he muttered under his breath, but the glint returned, brighter this time, reflecting off something smooth and metallic. The shadows shifted, and for the briefest of moments, he thought he saw a figure. Tall, impossibly lean, with an angular silhouette that didn't belong to any human he'd ever seen. It was gone before his mind could process it, leaving him rooted in place, his breath caught in his throat. Damien's rational mind screamed at him to run, to bolt the rest of the way through the alley and never look back. But his curiosity, that relentless itch that had driven him to engineering in the first place, kept him frozen. Against all better judgment, he stepped toward the spot where he'd seen the glint. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. He glanced around, feeling ridiculous. He was talking to shadows now. And then the air changed. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a vibration, a low thrumming pulse that he felt in his chest rather than heard. The sensation was electric, setting every nerve on edge. The golden shimmer returned, brighter this time, and Damien realized it wasn't a reflection. It was coming from something. Before he could react, the light surged toward him, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought it was alive. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet, and fell hard against the damp pavement. The bag slipped from his shoulder, its contents spilling out in a clatter of metal and plastic. He scrambled backward, his hands scraping against the ground, his eyes locked on the golden glow. The light dimmed, receding into the shape of a figure, a silhouette that seemed to solidify out of the air itself. It wasn't human. The figure stepped forward, and the flickering streetlight revealed more details than Damien wanted to see. The being was tall, its emerald green skin gleaming faintly under the artificial light. Its eyes glowed like molten gold, piercing and unblinking, framed by ridges that gave its face an angular, reptilian quality. Its body was encased in armor that looked alive, biomechanical plates shifting with each movement, sleek and predatory. Damien's breath hitched as he stared at the creature before him. It stared back, its gaze heavy with something he couldn't quite name, and then it spoke. "You are not what I expected," it said, its voice low and resonant, each word laced with an accent he couldn't place. Damien opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He felt like a specimen pinned under a microscope, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The being tilted its head, studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You don't even realize what you are, do you?" I don't understand," Damien stammered, his voice barely audible. The creature's expression shifted. Was that pity? Amusement? It was hard to tell. It crouched, bringing its face closer to his, and Damien noticed intricate patterns etched into its armor, glowing faintly like circuitry. "You will," it said, standing abruptly. "Soon." Before Damien could process the words, the creature turned and disappeared into the shadows, its form dissolving like smoke. For a long moment, Damien sat there, his heart pounding in his chest, the world around him eerily silent. He looked down at the spilled contents of his bag, his hands trembling as he gathered them. The golden light lingered in his vision long after it was gone, a phantom glow that refused to fade. The glow had followed him home, not physically, but in his mind, like an afterimage burned into his retinas. Damien sat slumped at his desk, staring at the inert artifact resting in the center of his workspace. His small apartment felt impossibly quiet, as though the world outside had been muted. Even the hum of the city, the ever-present drone of traffic, distant voices, and occasional sirens, was absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness that pressed against his eardrums. The artifact was unassuming, a smooth, grayish-black stone the size of his palm, with faint ridges that seemed natural rather than artificial. Yet, he couldn't shake the memory of the golden shimmer he'd seen back in the alley. He'd retrieved the stone from his desk drawer out of reflex the moment he'd returned home, as though it might hold the answers he so desperately needed. But it remained stubbornly lifeless. Damien exhaled and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His thoughts raced, looping over the same questions. Who or what had that creature been? Why had it spoken to him? And what did it mean by, "You don't even realize what you are"? And why did he feel like the answers were tied to this object? He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the stone's surface. It was cool to the touch, its texture smooth yet faintly rough, like sand worn down over centuries. A small part of him half expected it to react, to glow, hum, or otherwise betray some sign of the strange energy he was convinced it contained. Nothing. The silence in his apartment was broken by the soft whir of his AI assistant, ARI, coming online. The small, cube-like device sat on the corner of his desk, its interface glowing faintly blue. "Damien," ARI's soothing, gender-neutral voice said, "your heart rate is elevated. Shall I run a diagnostic?" Damien blinked at the sound, startled by how loud it seemed in the stillness. "No, ARI, I'm fine," he replied, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You do not sound fine," ARI observed. "Shall I play calming music?" "No," Damien said sharply, then softened his tone. "Just run a scan on this." He placed the artifact directly in front of the AI's sensors. ARI's interface brightened as it focused on the object. "Analyzing," it said. A soft hum filled the air, a sound Damien normally found reassuring. Tonight, it only made his nerves prickle. Minutes ticked by. ARI remained silent, the scan indicator on its interface flashing steadily. Finally, the hum ceased. "Analysis complete," ARI announced. "And?" Damien leaned forward, his heart pounding. "This object is composed of materials not found in any known geological database," ARI replied. "Its surface contains trace elements that do not correspond to any terrestrial mineral. Additionally, it emits faint electromagnetic pulses at irregular intervals." Damien's stomach tightened. He'd suspected as much. How could he not, after what had happened? But hearing ARI confirm it made the reality inescapable. "Could it be alien?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is a plausible hypothesis," ARI said, its tone maddeningly calm. "The electromagnetic signature is highly unusual. I recommend further study." Further study. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. Damien had always prided himself on his analytical mind, his ability to approach problems logically. But this was beyond anything he'd ever encountered. Before he could dwell on the implications, a sharp knock at his door shattered the fragile stillness. Damien froze. It was nearly midnight. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his friends, or what few he had, rarely visited unannounced. His pulse quickened as he rose from his chair, the weight of the artifact pressing against him like a silent accusation. The knock came again, louder this time. "Damien Cole," a voice called from the other side, low and unfamiliar. It wasn't a question. Whoever it was already knew he was there. He approached the door cautiously, his hand hovering over the latch. "Who is it?" he called, his voice wavering. "A messenger," the voice replied. "We need to talk." Damien hesitated. Something about the voice set his teeth on edge. It was calm, too calm, with an undertone of menace that made his skin crawl. "I don't know you," he said, trying to keep his tone firm. "I know," the voice replied. "But you've been noticed, Damien, and if you value your life, you'll open this door." Every instinct screamed at him to keep it shut. He glanced back at the artifact on his desk, its dark surface catching the faint light. He could feel the weight of it in the air, a silent reminder that whatever was happening to him, it was no accident. Finally, against his better judgment, he unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The figure standing in the hallway was human, or at least appeared to be. He was tall and lean, dressed in a plain black coat that seemed to absorb the light. His face was sharp and angular, his pale skin almost translucent under the flickering hallway bulb. But it was his eyes that gave Damien pause. They were an unnatural shade of blue, glowing faintly, like two frozen flames. "Who are you?" Damien demanded, his hand tightening on the edge of the door. The man tilted his head, a small, humorless smile playing at his lips. "A friend," he said, "though I suppose you won't believe that." "Try me," Damien said, his voice sharper than he felt. The man's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. Let's just say I'm someone with a vested interest in your survival. For now. Damien's grip on the doorframe tightened. And what's that supposed to mean? The man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It means you've stumbled onto something much bigger than yourself. That artifact? It's a beacon, and you're not the only one who's noticed its signal. Damien's stomach churned. Who else? The man straightened, his expression unreadable. People you don't want to meet, creatures you definitely don't want to meet. He reached into his coat, and Damien flinched, but the man only produced a small, sleek device. Take this, he said, pressing it into Damien's hand. It'll scramble the signal for a while, buy you some time, but not much. Time for what? Damien asked, his voice barely audible. The man's glowing eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the mask of calm slipped, revealing something darker, more desperate. To figure out if you're the key to salvation, he said, or the reason we all burn. And with that, the man turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Damien clutching the device and the artifact, his mind spinning with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The small device the stranger had given Damien sat on his desk, its black surface polished to an almost liquid sheen. It was deceptively simple in design, oval-shaped, with no visible buttons or markings save for a faint, pulsing line that ran along its edge. The artifact lay beside it, as inert and cryptic as ever, a quiet center of gravity in the room. Damien couldn't take his eyes off them. His thoughts felt scattered, threads pulling in every direction, none of them leading to clarity. Who was the stranger, and how had he known about the artifact? Why had he warned Damien? And what had he meant by salvation or the reason we all burn? Ares' voice broke the silence. Damien, your respiration rate is elevated again. Would you like me to adjust the room's atmospheric settings for relaxation? No, Damien muttered. He ran a hand down his face, trying to center himself. Ares, pull up everything you've got on electromagnetic signal interference. Let's see if we can figure out what this thing, he gestured to the device, is actually doing. Understood, Ari replied, the blue glow of its interface flickering as it processed the request. Compiling relevant data. Estimated time, 5 minutes. Damien exhaled, leaning back in his chair. 5 minutes wasn't long, but the tension in the room made every second feel heavy. He glanced again at the device, half expecting it to come alive under his gaze. Instead, the artifact reacted. It was subtle at first, a faint hum barely audible that seemed to emanate from within its dense surface. Damien straightened, his pulse quickening as he leaned closer. Ares, he said sharply. Are you picking that up? Affirmative, Ari replied. The artifact is emitting a low-frequency vibration, analyzing. Before Damien could respond, the hum intensified, rising in pitch. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation, a deep resonance that he could feel in his chest, in his bones. The lights in the apartment flickered, and Ari's glow dimmed, as though the energy in the room was being drained. Warning, Ari said, its voice distorted by static. Electromagnetic interference is escalating. I recommend immediate containment. The voice cut off abruptly as the artifact began to glow. Golden light seeped from its surface, the same otherworldly shimmer Damien had seen in the alley. It pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat, illuminating the room with an eerie liquid brilliance. Damien backed away instinctively, his chair scraping against the floor. The air grew heavy, charged with an electric tension that made his skin prickle. The artifact's glow brightened, casting shifting patterns on the walls, patterns that didn't make sense, geometric shapes that seemed to twist and fold in ways his mind couldn't fully comprehend. And then the room shifted. It wasn't like the room itself was moving. It was more as though reality around him had bent, just for a moment, before snapping back into place. Objects seemed to blur and waver in the periphery of his vision, their edges losing definition. Damien clutched the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "Airy!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "What's happening?" Static was his only reply. Suddenly, the pulsing stopped. The golden light dimmed, retreating back into the artifact like water being drawn into a sponge. The air in the room returned to normal, the oppressive weight lifting as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. The device the stranger had given him was glowing now, its faint pulse stronger, more insistent. As Damien stared, its smooth surface shifted, seams appearing where none had been before. The device unfolded like a blooming flower, revealing an intricate crystalline core that shimmered with the same golden hue as the artifact. Ares' voice returned, garbled but audible. "Artifact energy levels have synchronized with foreign device. Connection established. Warning, energy signature exceeds safe parameters." "What does that mean?" Damien demanded, his voice rising. "Unknown," ARI replied, its tone tinged with what Damien imagined was the closest thing to unease an AI could express. "The device appears to be amplifying the artifact's output." Before Damien could process the implications, the device emitted a sharp, piercing tone that made him wince. A holographic display flickered into existence above it, shimmering and unstable. The image that formed was incomprehensible at first, a chaotic swirl of lights and shapes, like a storm of data coalescing into form. Slowly, the chaos resolved into something tangible, a map. But it wasn't any map Damien recognized. The projection showed a vast, sprawling expanse of stars and planets, a detailed chart of a region of space far beyond anything humanity had ever explored. At the center of the map was a single pulsing point of light, marked with alien symbols that shifted and morphed as he watched. "What is this?" Damien whispered, his voice barely audible. "The map represents a region of space located approximately 78,000 light-years from Earth," ARI said. "The central marker appears to indicate a specific location of significance. Cross-referencing with known astronomical data. No match found." Damien's stomach churned. "Why would this show up now? What does it have to do with me?" "The artifact's resonance appears to have triggered this display," ARI replied. "Given the stranger's warning, it is reasonable to hypothesize that the marked location is related to the artifact's purpose." Damien stared at the map, his mind racing. Was this the reason the creature in the alley had spared him? Was this the beacon the stranger had mentioned? A new thought struck him, cold and sharp. If this artifact had sent a signal across space, how many others had noticed? As if in answer, a loud crash echoed from outside his apartment. Damien spun toward the window, his heart hammering. He approached cautiously, peering through the blinds. What he saw made his blood run cold. A sleek black vehicle hovered in the street below, its design unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its surface glistened with an iridescent sheen, and strange glyphs pulsed faintly along its sides. From it emerged figures clad in armor eerily similar to the creatures from the alley, sleek, biomechanical, and impossibly alien. They moved with precision, their golden eyes scanning the surroundings as they advanced toward his building. Damien's breath caught in his throat. They were coming for him, for the artifact. And they weren't here to talk. The hum of the alien vehicle outside his apartment was unnervingly quiet, more like a whisper than a roar, yet it carried an ominous weight. Damien crouched low, peering through a crack in the blinds, his breath shallow and ragged. The figures emerging from the craft moved with an almost predatory grace, their armor reflecting faint pulses of light, the glyphs carved into their sleek exoskeletons flickering like living things. There were 3 of them. Their movements were synchronized, deliberate, as though they shared a single mind. One tilted its head toward the building, a faint golden glow emanating from its helmet. Damien froze as it paused, turning slightly, its gaze, or what he imagined was its gaze, fixing on his window. He ducked instinctively, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain they'd hear it. "Damien!" Ares' voice cut through the tense silence, subdued but urgent. Scans indicate an approaching threat. I recommend immediate evacuation." "You don't say," he muttered under his breath, gripping the edge of the desk. His eyes flicked to the artifact and the strange device, both still humming softly in a language of light and energy he couldn't understand. A part of him wanted to leave them behind, to run and never look back. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. The artifact was the reason they were here. Whatever signal it had sent, whatever message it had conveyed across the vast distances of space, it had summoned these beings. Running would only delay the inevitable. His thoughts churned, frantic and desperate. What did they want? To retrieve the artifact? To kill him? Or something worse? "Are," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Can you disrupt their sensors? Scramble their tech or something?" "Negative," Ari replied. "Their technology is far beyond my processing capabilities. However," the AI hesitated, as though reluctant to continue. "However what?" Damien snapped, his frustration spilling over. "There is a high probability that the artifact's electromagnetic signature is attracting them. Deactivating the artifact may delay their pursuit." Damien glanced at the glowing object. Deactivate it? How? The artifact had no discernible controls, no buttons, no switches. It responded to some deeper, more fundamental force he didn't understand. Before he could process the thought further, a sharp metallic sound rang out, a blade of energy cutting through steel. The air filled with the acrid smell of scorched metal as the armored figures breached the front entrance of the building. Damien's pulse spiked. They were inside. He grabbed the artifact and the device, shoving them into his bag with shaking hands. "Ari, guide me to the fire escape," he hissed, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "Understood. Exit the apartment and proceed left. Fire escape access is 20 meters down the hall." Damien reached for the door, his hand trembling as he unlocked it. He opened it just a crack, peering into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty, but the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell. The hunters were systematic, methodical, clearing each floor as they ascended. He slipped out quietly, his sneakers barely making a sound against the worn carpet. The hallway stretched ahead, every shadow a potential hiding place, every creak of the building settling a harbinger of doom. The fire escape was close. He could see the red sign glowing faintly at the end of the corridor, but as he approached, another sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like claws tapping against metal. He froze, his blood turning cold. One of the hunters was there, standing at the base of the fire escape. Its golden eyes swept the hallway, scanning with an unsettling precision. Damien pressed himself against the wall, his heart hammering. He was out of time. In that moment, a surge of defiance coursed through him. He couldn't keep running, not forever. If this artifact was connected to him, if it truly was the key to something greater, then he needed to understand it. Now. His hand tightened around the strap of his bag as he retreated back toward his apartment. The door clicked shut behind him, and he locked it, leaning against the cool wood as he struggled to catch his breath. "Ari," he said, his voice a mix of desperation and determination. "I need answers. How do I deactivate this thing?" "Analysis of the artifact suggests it is not a conventional device," Ari replied. "Its functions appear to be governed by quantum resonance, possibly linked to your biological signature." "My biological signature?" Damien repeated, his voice incredulous. "Affirmative. The artifact has demonstrated a reactive connection to your presence. It is likely you are a catalyst for its activation and deactivation." Damien stared at the glowing object in his hands, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do? Meditate? Command it to shut down? The absurdity of the situation made him want to laugh, but the distant sound of the hunters advancing up the stairwell kept him focused. "Fine," he muttered, placing the artifact on the desk. He closed his eyes, his hands hovering over its surface. "Deactivate. Power down. Stop glowing or whatever it is you're doing." The artifact remained stubbornly luminous. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Come on," he shouted, slamming his hands onto the desk. The instant his palms made contact, the artifact reacted. Its light flared brilliantly, filling the room with an intense, golden radiance. Damien felt a strange warmth coursing through his body, as though the artifact were pulling energy directly from him. For a moment, he was overwhelmed by a cascade of images, stars burning in the void, planets crumbling into dust, and something vast and ancient stirring in the darkness. The visions were fleeting, but left a profound sense of unease in their wake. The artifact's glow dimmed suddenly, its light retreating until it was dark and inert once more. The oppressive energy in the room dissipated, leaving Damien breathless and trembling. "Artifact deactivated," ARI announced. "Electromagnetic signature neutralized." Damien slumped back in his chair, his chest heaving. But his relief was short-lived. A loud crash echoed through the building as one of the hunters forced its way onto his floor. The hallway lights flickered, and the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps approached his door. Deactivating the artifact had bought him time, but not enough. "ARE," he whispered, his voice raw. "Options?" "None favorable," ARI replied. "I recommend immediate surrender." Damien's jaw tightened. Surrender wasn't an option, not if he wanted to survive. Gripping his bag tightly, he braced himself. If they were coming for him, he wasn't going down without a fight. The door splintered under the force of the alien hunter's strike, shards of wood scattering like 1,000 brittle stars. Damien stumbled back, his heart pounding as the armored figure stepped into the apartment. Its golden eyes glowed like twin suns, cold and unrelenting, scanning the room before locking onto him. It didn't speak. It didn't hesitate. It advanced. The artifact, still inert on the desk, seemed almost insignificant in the face of this relentless predator. Yet Damien knew its weight, its importance. It was the reason he was still alive. And it was the reason these creatures would not stop until they had it. He reached into his bag, fumbling for the stranger's device. The crystalline core shimmered faintly, as if responding to the charged atmosphere. Clutching it tightly, Damien raised it like a shield. "Stay back!" he shouted, though his voice trembled with fear. The hunter stopped. It cocked its head, the glyphs on its armor shifting in what looked like fluid motion. For a moment, it seemed to study him, calculating. Then, with a fluid motion, it raised its weapon, a sleek, curved blade of pulsing energy. Time slowed. Damien's instinct screamed at him to run, but something deeper held him rooted in place. A memory, hazy but insistent, surfaced. The stranger's words in the alley. "You are the key. Salvation or the reason we all burn." If he ran, he'd burn. If he fought, he might still burn, but at least he'd have a chance to learn why. The hunter lunged. Damien reacted on instinct, thrusting the device forward. A burst of energy erupted from its crystalline core, a shockwave of golden light that filled the room. The hunter staggered, its blade dissipating as it struggled against the force. Glyphs on its armor flared erratically, its movements jerky and disoriented. For a moment, Damien thought he'd won. Then the second and third hunters arrived. They stepped into the apartment with unnerving precision, their golden eyes fixed on him. The first hunter recovered, its movement smoothing as it joined its companions. Together they advanced, their synchronization a silent, terrifying display of alien efficiency. The device in Damien's hand pulsed again, brighter this time, but instead of pushing them back, the energy seemed to draw them closer. Their glyphs flared in response, as though they were feeding off the same signal. Damien's mind raced. The artifact's energy had been neutralized, but now the device, the one meant to help him, was amplifying the danger. He glanced at the artifact, dark and lifeless on the desk, and a terrible realization dawned on him. The device wasn't just a tool for him, it was a beacon for them. "ARI," he whispered, panic tightening his throat. "What happens if I destroy this thing?" "Uncertain," ARI replied, its voice calm despite the chaos. "However, the device appears to function as a conduit for the artifact's energy. Severing the connection may destabilize the signal permanently. Or it might kill me, Damien muttered bitterly. He tightened his grip on the device. The hunters were nearly upon him. He had no time left to think. With a guttural yell, Damien swung the device down onto the desk with all his strength. The crystalline core shattered on impact, a burst of light and sound erupting from its center. The shockwave threw him back, slamming him into the wall. The hunters, too, were knocked off balance, their glyphs dimming as they struggled to recover. The artifact reawakened. Golden light poured from its surface, brighter and more intense than ever before. The energy filled the room, enveloping everything in its radiant embrace. Damien felt it coursing through him, a torrent of warmth and power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. And then the voice came. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was more like a presence, vast and ancient, speaking directly to his mind. The words were incomprehensible, yet he understood them on some primal level. Images flooded his consciousness, a dying star collapsing into a black hole, galaxies colliding in slow cosmic violence, and a figure, a being of light and shadow, standing at the center of it all. "You are the vessel," the voice said. "The bridge. Choose." The hunters froze, their golden eyes dimming as if they too could hear the voice. For the first time, they hesitated. Damien's mind reeled. Choose? Choose what? He thought of the stranger in the alley, of Virasha, and of the warning she had given him. Killing you would doom us all. Sparing you is no guarantee of salvation. He closed his eyes, centering himself. What do you want from me? He whispered. The voice responded, not with words, but with a feeling, an overwhelming sense of unity, of connection. He saw the artifact not as a mere object, but as a living entity, a fragment of something far greater. Its purpose wasn't destruction, but balance. The hunters, their synchronization broken, moved again, their actions hesitant. One stepped forward, its golden eyes flickering as it extended a hand, not in aggression, but in supplication. Damien understood. They weren't here to kill him. They were here because they feared him, because they feared what he represented. He placed his hand on the artifact. The light flared once more, consuming the room, the hunters, and everything else in a blinding, all-encompassing radiance. When the light faded, Damien was alone. The hunters were gone, their glyphs, their armor, their presence wiped away as though they had never existed. The artifact sat on the desk, inert once more, its golden glow extinguished. Ares' voice returned, soft and steady. Signal terminated. Threat neutralized. Damien sank into the chair, his body trembling with exhaustion. The weight of the artifact's significance pressed on him like a mountain. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, but one thing was clear. His life would never return to normal. The artifact wasn't just an object, it was a choice, a responsibility. And Damien Cole, unassuming tech engineer, was now its guardian. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, he stared at the darkened artifact and whispered to himself, "What happens next?" The artifact, silent and inscrutable, gave no reply.